If my son had simply stolen my house, I think I could have forgiven him. If my daughter-in-law had insulted me to my face, I could have survived that too. But what happened on my 73rd birthday was something I never imagined. Because the people I loved most didn't throw me out. They made me feel like I no longer belonged in my own family. And that kind of wound takes much longer to heal. My name is Eleanor Whitaker. I am 73 years old. I live in Ohio. Or at least, I used to know exactly where I belonged. For most of my life, I believed I had been blessed. Not lucky. Blessed. There is a difference. Lucky people win things. Blessed people build things. And I spent nearly 50 years building a family. My husband Richard and I married in the summer of 1971. Neither of us had money. The reception was held in my parents' backyard. The cake leaned slightly to one side because my aunt baked it herself. Half the folding chairs came from the church basement. And somehow, it was perfect. We bought our first house 3 years later. A small ranch home with faded yellow siding. 900 square feet. 1 bathroom. A kitchen so tiny that if Richard opened the refrigerator door while I was cooking, somebody had to move. We loved that house. Not because it was beautiful. Because it was ours. We raised 2 children there. Our son Daniel. And our daughter Rebecca. I packed school lunches. Attended soccer games. Stayed awake through fevers. Worked part-time at the library when money was tight. Worked full-time when it was tighter. Like most mothers of my generation, I didn't keep score. I assumed sacrifice was simply part of the job. And for many years, I never questioned that belief. Richard passed away 11 years ago. Heart failure. Quick. Unexpected. One ordinary Tuesday. One phone call. And suddenly I was learning how to be a widow. Anyone who has lived through that kind of loss knows something younger people often don't understand. The grief doesn't arrive all at once. It arrives in pieces. A quiet breakfast. An empty chair. A light left off because nobody else is coming home. A joke you hear and instinctively turn to share. Only to remember. They're gone. Daniel was wonderful during that first year. He called often. Visited regularly. Fixed things around the house. Made sure I wasn't alone during holidays. I was proud of him. Still am, in many ways. Because life is rarely as simple as heroes and villains. That's something age teaches you. People can love you. And still hurt you. People can mean well. And still make terrible choices. The trouble started slowly. So slowly that I didn't recognize it. Daniel had built a successful financial consulting business. His wife, Melissa, worked in marketing. They had 2 children. Emma and Caleb. Beautiful kids. Smart kids. The kind of grandchildren who make you forget every ache in your knees. Over time, conversations changed. At first it was small comments. Harmless sounding observations. Mom, this house is probably too much for one person. Eleanor, have you ever thought about downsizing? You'd have more freedom in a condo. You wouldn't have to worry about maintenance. Reasonable comments. Practical comments. The sort of thing loving family members might genuinely say. And honestly, part of me agreed. The house was getting harder to maintain. The stairs felt steeper every year. Winter seemed colder. The yard seemed larger. Everything took longer. So when Daniel suggested helping me review my finances, I said yes. When Melissa offered to organize paperwork, I said yes. When they encouraged me to think about the future, I listened. Because they were family. And because trusting your children doesn't feel dangerous. Until one day it does. Looking back now, I can see moments I missed. Tiny warning signs. Conversations that ended abruptly when I entered the room. Documents that appeared unexpectedly. Decisions that seemed rushed. But hindsight is a luxury. When you're living through something, you only see one day at a time. And one day at a time, everything looked normal. At least on the surface. My 73rd birthday arrived in early October. The weather was beautiful. Crisp air. Blue skies. Leaves beginning to turn gold. Melissa insisted on hosting a family dinner. She said she wanted to make it special. I remember feeling touched. Grateful. Loved. The dining room looked lovely when I arrived. Candles. Flowers. A homemade cake. The grandchildren running around laughing. The kind of evening every mother hopes for. I sat at the head of the table. Not because anyone assigned me the seat. Because that had always been my seat. For decades. Family traditions have invisible rules. Nobody writes them down. Everybody simply knows. Or so I thought. Halfway through dinner, Melissa smiled and stood. She tapped her glass with a spoon. The room became quiet. I expected a birthday toast. Maybe a few embarrassing stories. A funny memory. Instead, she announced something else. Something that would change everything. At first, everyone smiled. Including me. Because none of us understood what those words truly meant. Not yet. But by the end of that evening, I would begin to realize something terrifying. The family I believed I had spent 50 years building might no longer have room for me inside it. And the worst part? The people hurting me didn't see themselves as villains. They believed they were being practical. Responsible. Reasonable. That was what made it so dangerous. Because cruelty wrapped inside good intentions can be almost impossible to recognize until it's too late. Rebecca stared into her coffee for several seconds before speaking. That alone worried me. My daughter had never been good at hiding her feelings. As a little girl, she cried when she was sad. As a teenager, she slammed doors when she was angry. As an adult, she still wore her emotions right on her face. Whatever she came to tell me, she didn't want to be the one saying it. Finally, she looked up. Mom, I need you to promise not to get upset with me. I almost laughed. Anyone over 70 knows that's one of the most dangerous sentences in the English language. Nothing good ever follows it. I'll do my best, I said. Rebecca nodded. Then took a deep breath. Daniel and Melissa have been talking about this for almost a year. For a moment, I didn't understand. Then I did. The house. The brochures. The conversations. The plans. Almost a year. I sat quietly. Not because I was shocked. Because I was trying not to react too quickly. At my age, I've learned something valuable. The first version of a story is rarely the whole story. Talking about what exactly? Rebecca hesitated. They think you're lonely. That wasn't what I expected. Not because I disagreed completely. Widowhood can be lonely. There are evenings when silence feels heavier than furniture. There are holidays that never quite feel the same. There are moments when grief sneaks up on you unexpectedly. But lonely and incapable are not the same thing. And too often, people confuse them. Rebecca continued. They worry about you living alone. That sounded more reasonable. More understandable. I nodded slowly. I suppose that's fair. But that's not all. There it was. The part she'd really come to discuss. I could hear it in her voice. Rebecca looked toward the kitchen window. Avoiding my eyes. When Daniel talks about the future, she said carefully. He talks about the house more than he talks about you. The words landed harder than I expected. Not because they proved anything. They didn't. Not yet. But because they echoed a concern I hadn't wanted to admit. The house seemed to appear in every conversation. The value. The location. The property taxes. The neighborhood. The equity. The future. Always the future. Never the memories. Never the life inside it. Just the asset. I folded my hands together. Trying to remain fair. Trying to remain objective. Daniel wasn't a bad man. He wasn't cruel. He wasn't some cartoon villain plotting against his elderly mother. Life isn't usually that simple. The Daniel I raised loved his family. Worked hard. Supported his children. Helped neighbors. Volunteered at church. That version of him was real. The problem was, another version of him seemed to be emerging. A version increasingly concerned with money. Status. Pressure. Responsibility. And perhaps fear. Especially fear. Rebecca seemed to read my thoughts. Mom, I don't think he's trying to hurt you. I appreciated her honesty. Because she wasn't defending him. She wasn't accusing him. She was wrestling with something complicated. The same thing I was. Love and disappointment can exist at the same time. Many parents spend their lives learning that lesson. Then why does this feel wrong? I asked quietly. Rebecca didn't answer immediately. Instead, she looked around the kitchen. The same kitchen where she learned multiplication tables. The same kitchen where Richard carved Thanksgiving turkey. The same kitchen where countless family arguments began and ended. Finally she said. Because nobody ever asked what you wanted. The room fell silent. Not dramatic silence. Just truth. The kind of truth that doesn't need embellishment. Because she was right. Nobody had asked. Everyone had opinions. Suggestions. Plans. Ideas. But nobody had sat down and said, Mom, what do you want? It seems like a small thing. Until it isn't. Rebecca left shortly afterward. Not because the conversation was over. Because she had children waiting at home. A husband. A life. Responsibilities. Before leaving, she hugged me tightly. Longer than usual. As though she sensed something changing. Maybe she did. After the front door closed, I remained at the kitchen table. Thinking. Not about selling. Not about moving. About agency. The ability to decide your own future. Something many people take for granted until others begin making decisions for them. The following week brought Thanksgiving. Normally my favorite holiday. No presents. No pressure. Just family. Food. Stories. Gratitude. Simple things. The older I get, the more I value simple things. This year felt different. Not terrible. Just different. Like a familiar song played slightly out of tune. Dinner took place at Daniel and Melissa's house. The grandchildren were excited. Football played in the background. The smell of turkey filled the air. Everything looked perfect. And maybe that was part of the problem. Families often become experts at looking perfect. Long before they become healthy. After dinner, while everyone else watched football, I wandered into the kitchen to help clean up. Melissa was already there. Loading dishes. Wrapping leftovers. Organizing containers. The woman genuinely worked hard. I'll always give her credit for that. For a few minutes, we chatted normally. Recipes. The weather. The children. Then she said something that caught me off guard. I hope you know we're only trying to help. I looked at her. Really looked at her. For the first time in months. Melissa looked tired. Not manipulative. Not triumphant. Tired. The kind of tired that comes from carrying too much responsibility. That realization complicated things. Because villains are easy. Real people aren't. What makes you think I need help? I asked gently. Melissa stopped what she was doing. Not defensive. Just thoughtful. My mom fell and broke her hip when she was 70. A pause. Everything changed after that. I hadn't known that story. Or maybe she'd mentioned it years ago and I'd forgotten. Either way, I listened. My father ignored all the warning signs, she continued. He kept saying they were fine. Another pause. Then suddenly they weren't. For the first time. I saw fear. Not greed. Not ambition. Fear. Real fear. The kind people carry after watching someone they love suffer. And suddenly Melissa became more understandable. Not necessarily correct. But understandable. That's an important distinction. People can be wrong for reasons that make perfect sense to them. The conversation stayed with me all evening. Driving home afterward, I found myself questioning my assumptions. Maybe Daniel was worried. Maybe Melissa was afraid. Maybe neither of them realized how their actions felt from my side. Maybe. Or maybe Rebecca was right. Maybe the house had become part of the equation. Perhaps both things could be true at once. Life often works that way. Two conflicting truths sharing the same space. December arrived early and cold. Snow dusted rooftops. Christmas lights appeared throughout the neighborhood. The town looked beautiful. Almost magical. One afternoon, I stopped by the local diner after a doctor's appointment. Nothing unusual. Just coffee and pie. The sort of small pleasure retirement allows. I had barely sat down when I heard a familiar voice. Mrs. Whitaker? I turned. It was Carl Henderson. A real estate agent I'd known for years. Not a close friend. But someone I'd seen around town for decades. Carl smiled warmly. Then said something that made my stomach tighten. I hear congratulations are in order. I blinked. Congratulations for what? Carl looked confused. Genuinely confused. The kind of confusion people show when they accidentally reveal information they assumed everyone already knew. The house. My heart skipped. What house? Carl's smile slowly disappeared. For the first time, he realized something was wrong. Then he said the sentence that would keep me awake for days. I thought Daniel already talked to you. A pause. Then another. And suddenly I knew. Whatever Daniel had been discussing with real estate agents. He believed those conversations were happening with my knowledge. Or he hoped people would assume they were. Either possibility left me with far more questions than answers. And for the first time, I stopped wondering whether something was happening behind my back. I started wondering how much. For the rest of that afternoon, I couldn't stop thinking about what Carl Henderson had said. Not because it proved anything. It didn't. At least not yet. But it introduced a question I couldn't ignore. Why would a real estate agent assume my house was about to be sold? More importantly, where had he heard that idea? I finished my coffee. Paid the bill. Drove home through light snow. And spent most of the evening staring out my living room window. The Christmas lights across the street blinked softly against the darkness. Normally, I loved this time of year. But something felt different now. Not ruined. Just unsettled. Like a puzzle with one missing piece. You can't stop thinking about it because you know something isn't fitting together properly. The next morning, I called Carl. Not because I was angry. Because I wanted facts. Age teaches you something valuable. Assumptions create problems. Facts solve them. Carl answered on the second ring. When I explained why I was calling, he immediately sounded uncomfortable. Not defensive. Embarrassed. The poor man realized he had stepped into a family situation without meaning to. Mrs. Whitaker, I honestly thought you knew. I believe that, I told him. Just help me understand. There was a pause. Then Carl spoke carefully. Daniel asked me about property values last spring. Last spring. Almost 8 months earlier. That caught my attention. Because my birthday dinner had happened only recently. Which meant these conversations began long before the brochures. Long before the retirement communities. Long before anyone mentioned moving. Carl continued. He asked general questions. About the market. About timing. About what homes in your neighborhood were selling for. That sounded reasonable. At least initially. Lots of people ask real estate questions. Especially financially minded people. Then Carl added something else. Later he asked whether properties sometimes stay within families. I remained silent. Listening. He mentioned wanting to preserve family assets. Family assets. Not family memories. Not family history. Assets. Again that word. Again that mindset. Carl wasn't accusing Daniel of anything. In fact, he sounded as though he admired him. The problem wasn't what Daniel said. The problem was the pattern. The same language. The same priorities. The same assumptions. Over and over. When the call ended, I thanked Carl. Then I sat quietly in my kitchen. Thinking. A memory surfaced unexpectedly. About 5 years earlier. Richard's younger brother, Frank, had passed away. Frank left behind a modest house and 3 adult children. The children spent nearly 2 years fighting over it. Not because they needed the money. Because everyone believed they deserved something different. One wanted fairness. One wanted sentiment. One wanted cash. The arguments nearly destroyed the family. I remember Richard saying something at the time. Something simple. People don't fight about houses. I had asked what he meant. He said. They fight about what the house represents. At the time, I thought he was being philosophical. Now I wondered if he was being practical. Because maybe Daniel wasn't obsessed with the property. Maybe he was obsessed with what ownership symbolized. Security. Success. Achievement. Stability. Perhaps all of those things. The following weekend, Emma came over unexpectedly. My granddaughter was 16 now. Tall. Smart. Funny. Too observant for her own good. She reminded me of Rebecca at that age. She arrived carrying a plate of Christmas cookies. Melissa had baked them. Or at least most of them. Emma admitted she ate nearly half the cookie dough before it reached the oven. That sounded believable. We spent an hour decorating my Christmas tree. One of my favorite traditions. The same ornaments. The same stories. Year after year. Children grow older. Grandparents grow older. But somehow the ornaments remain. As Emma unpacked a handmade ornament from 2nd grade, she suddenly asked. Grandma, are you really moving? The question hit me harder than it should have. Not because of the words. Because of how casually she asked them. As though the decision already existed. As though everyone knew. Except me. I forced a smile. Why would you ask that? Emma shrugged. Then immediately looked guilty. The way teenagers do when they accidentally reveal too much. I said nothing. Just waited. Eventually she sighed. My parents talk about it sometimes. My chest tightened. Not dramatically. Just enough. Talk about what? The house. There it was again. The house. Always the house. Emma sat cross-legged on the living room floor. Twisting ribbon around one finger. trying to choose her words carefully. I don't think they're trying to be mean. Interesting. That was almost exactly what Rebecca had said. Not mean. Not villains. Just people making choices. Emma continued. Dad says he's worried about you. I nodded. That part one believed. Completely. Despite everything, I still believed it. Then Emma added. But sometimes Mom talks about how perfect this location would be for us. The room grew quiet. Not because the statement shocked me. Because it confirmed something. Different people can want different things from the same situation. Daniel might genuinely worry about me. Melissa might genuinely see opportunity. Neither necessarily cancels the other. Human beings are complicated. That's one reason family conflicts become so painful. Everyone is carrying their own truth. Their own fears. Their own dreams. The problem is that those truths don't always fit together. After Emma left, I found myself looking around the house differently. Not emotionally. Objectively. The hardwood floors Richard installed himself. The kitchen cabinets we refinished 3 separate times. The marks on the pantry door tracking the children's height through the years. The house wasn't valuable because of real estate. The house was valuable because it contained evidence. Evidence that we had lived here. Loved here. Struggled here. Built something here. And suddenly I realized something important. The question wasn't whether I would eventually leave. One day, everyone leaves. Either voluntarily or otherwise. The real question was whether that decision belonged to me. Christmas arrived 2 weeks later. Snow covered the neighborhood. The grandchildren opened presents. Rebecca brought her famous sweet potato casserole. Melissa hosted dinner. Everything appeared normal. Again. That was becoming a theme. Families often look healthiest from a distance. After dinner, while everyone sat around the living room, Daniel approached me. Mom, can we talk privately? My stomach immediately tightened. Not because I knew what was coming. Because I suspected. We stepped into his home office. The door closed behind us. Daniel looked nervous. More nervous than I'd seen him in years. That surprised me. Because confidence had never been his problem. For a moment, he simply stood there. Gathering his thoughts. Then he said. I think we've avoided this conversation long enough. There it was. The conversation. Not a conversation. The conversation. As though both of us already knew exactly what he meant. Maybe we did. I sat down. Daniel remained standing. A little boy habit he'd never fully outgrown. Whenever he felt anxious, he paced. Even at 50 years old. Some things never change. Finally he stopped. Looked directly at me. And said something I wasn't prepared to hear. Mom, I don't think you're safe living alone anymore. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Because those words weren't really about safety. At least not entirely. They represented something much bigger. And I had a feeling that whatever happened next would determine the future of our family for years to come. I looked at my son for a long moment before answering. Not because I was offended. Not because I was angry. Because I wanted to understand exactly what he meant. At 73 years old, you learn that words often hide other words beneath them. Especially inside families. I don't think I'm safe. I repeated the sentence slowly. Daniel immediately shook his head. Mom, that's not what I meant. Then he paused. Which told me it was exactly what he meant. Or at least part of it. The office felt unusually small. Outside the door, I could hear distant laughter from the living room. The grandchildren. The football game. The sound of a family Christmas continuing as if nothing was wrong. Meanwhile, my son and I were having a conversation neither of us wanted. Daniel sat down across from me. His shoulders looked tired. Not weak. Tired. There is a difference. For the first time in months, I noticed something I had been overlooking. My son was carrying stress. A tremendous amount of it. The gray at his temples seemed darker. The lines around his eyes deeper. The confident businessman everyone admired looked exhausted. That realization didn't excuse anything. But it mattered. Because understanding people and agreeing with them are two different things. "Mom," he said quietly, "I worry about you." I believed him. Immediately. Completely. That wasn't the problem. The problem was what came next. I live 20 minutes away. He leaned forward. If something happened in the middle of the night. He stopped. Searching for words. If you fell. If you got sick. If you needed help. I wouldn't know. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Because every older person eventually hears some version of that conversation. And sometimes the concern is genuine. Sometimes it isn't. Most often. It's both. I nodded slowly. I understand. Daniel looked relieved. As though he expected resistance. But I wasn't resisting. Not yet. Understanding someone's fear doesn't mean surrendering your independence. "Can I ask you something?" I said. "Of course. Why did you start talking to real estate agents before talking to me?" The relief disappeared from his face instantly. There it was. The question he didn't want. Not because he didn't have an answer. Because he knew how it sounded. Daniel looked away. Toward the bookshelf. Toward the window. Anywhere except me. Finally he sighed. It wasn't like that. A sentence older than time itself. Whenever someone says it wasn't like that, it was usually at least a little bit like that. "I'm listening." Daniel rubbed his forehead. A habit he inherited from his father. Richard used to do the same thing whenever life became complicated. I was just gathering information. 8 months ago. His eyes widened slightly. Apparently he hadn't expected me to know the timeline. I didn't mention Carl. I didn't need to. The silence did the work for me. Finally Daniel nodded. Yes. Another silence. Then he surprised me. By telling the truth. At least part of it. I've been worried for a long time. Not weeks. Not months. Years. That was what I heard. Years. And suddenly I began seeing the situation differently. Not better. Differently. Because from Daniel's perspective, this conversation didn't start at my birthday dinner. It started much earlier. Perhaps with every icy driveway. Every roof repair. Every winter storm. Every time I climbed a ladder when I shouldn't have. Every time I insisted I was fine. Maybe his fear had been growing quietly for years. The way mine was growing now. The problem was that fear makes people impatient. And impatient people begin making decisions for others. Did you ever think about asking me what I wanted? The question came out softer than I intended. Daniel looked genuinely hurt. Not defensive. Hurt. And that caught me off guard. Because guilt and hurt often look similar from a distance. I thought I knew. There it was. The sentence that explained everything. Not greed. Not cruelty. Not conspiracy. Assumption. The belief that he already knew the answer. The belief that he understood my future better than I did. That realization frightened me more than any real estate discussion. Because assumptions are harder to argue with than facts. People who assume they're helping rarely stop to ask permission. We sat quietly for a moment. Then Daniel said something unexpected. Something honest. "I don't want to lose you." The office became very still. Because suddenly we weren't discussing houses. Or retirement communities. Or real estate. We were discussing mortality. Every child eventually realizes their parents won't live forever. Some handle that realization gracefully. Others try to control it. I reached across the desk and touched his hand. The same hand I held crossing streets when he was 5 years old. The same hand I bandaged after bicycle accidents. The same hand that now looked older than I remembered. We're all going to lose each other eventually. Daniel looked down. I know. No. I shook my head gently. I don't think you do. His eyes filled slightly. Not with tears. With fear. The kind people spend years avoiding. And suddenly I understood something. Part of this wasn't about the house. Part of it wasn't even about me. Part of it was Daniel struggling with the reality that his mother was 73 years old. That time was moving forward. That life was changing. That nothing stays the same forever. Those are difficult truths. At any age. But especially when they're attached to someone you love. Eventually we returned to the living room. Neither of us mentioned the conversation. The evening continued. Presents were opened. Stories were shared. Photographs were taken. To anyone watching, it looked like a wonderful Christmas. And maybe it was. Life can contain joy and tension at the same time. Most families do. The weeks after Christmas passed quietly. At least on the surface. January arrived with freezing temperatures. Ohio settled into one of those gray winters that seem endless. I stayed busy. The library. Church activities. Lunch with friends. Volunteer work twice a week. The ordinary rhythm of a life I genuinely enjoyed. One Tuesday afternoon, I met my friend Carol for lunch. Carol and I had known each other for almost 40 years. Long enough to stop pretending. Long enough to tell the truth. The real truth. Not the polite version. Halfway through lunch, she looked at me and asked, "What aren't you telling me?" I laughed. Because good friends can see through you. Sometimes better than family can. So I told her everything. The birthday dinner. The brochures. The conversation with Daniel. The real estate questions. All of it. Carol listened carefully. Without interrupting. Without rushing to judgment. When I finished, she stirred her coffee for a moment. Then asked a question nobody else had asked. Not Rebecca. Not Daniel. Not Melissa. Nobody. What do you want? There it was again. The question that seemed missing from every conversation. What do you want? Simple. Direct. Obvious. Yet somehow forgotten. I opened my mouth. Then stopped. Because the truth surprised me. For months I had been reacting to everyone else's plans. Everyone else's fears. Everyone else's ideas. I hadn't actually answered the question for myself. Carol smiled. See? I nodded slowly. She was right. I didn't know. Not completely. Maybe one day I would move. Maybe one day I wouldn't. But if that decision ever happened, I wanted it to come from me. Not from pressure. Not from assumptions. Not from a family meeting held without me. That evening, I returned home feeling strangely lighter. For the first time in months, I wasn't thinking about Daniel's plan. Or Melissa's plan. Or anyone else's plan. I was thinking about my own future. And that felt important. What I didn't know was that before winter ended, would discover something that changed the entire situation. Not because it revealed a villain. Not because it exposed a crime. But because it showed me exactly how far the conversations about my future had already gone. Farther than anyone had admitted. And once I saw the evidence for myself, there would be no pretending anymore. By February, life had settled into an uneasy rhythm. Not peaceful. Not hostile. Just uncertain. The brochures stopped arriving. Daniel stopped mentioning retirement communities. Melissa stopped bringing up downsizing. On the surface, everything seemed normal again. Almost too normal. That should have comforted me. Instead, it made me suspicious. Because unresolved problems rarely disappear. They simply go quiet for a while. And quiet things have a habit of resurfacing when you least expect them. One snowy Thursday morning, I was sorting through paperwork at home. Nothing exciting. Tax documents. Insurance statements. Utility bills. The glamorous side of retirement. As I worked, I came across a folder Richard had labeled years ago. House records. Richard loved labels. Every folder. Every drawer. Every tool in the garage. If the man could have labeled clouds, he probably would have. The memory made me smile. Then it made me sad. Grief is funny that way. Even after 11 years. The smile and the sadness often arrive together. I opened the folder. Inside were decades of documents. Mortgage records. Property tax statements. Renovation permits. Old receipts. The history of a life. Most people look at paperwork and see numbers. I see memories. The receipt from the kitchen remodel. The permit for the deck Richard built himself. The estimate for replacing the roof after a storm back in 1998. Every piece of paper told a story. I spent nearly 2 hours organizing everything. Then I noticed something unusual. Not alarming. Just unusual. Several documents were missing. Specifically, recent copies. Property records. Tax assessments. Current valuation reports. Nothing critical. Nothing impossible to replace. But enough to catch my attention. At first, I assumed I had misplaced them. Age teaches humility. The first explanation is usually the simplest one. So I checked the filing cabinet. Then the desk. Then the hall closet. Nothing. By late afternoon, curiosity got the better of me. I logged into the county property website. The records were easy enough to access. Public information. Nothing secret. A few minutes later, I found what I was looking for. Current valuation estimates. Property history. Tax information. Everything seemed normal. Until I noticed a recent access authorization. My brow furrowed. I wasn't particularly tech-savvy, but I wasn't helpless either. Several months earlier, the county had introduced a new online homeowner portal. Property owners could grant limited access to accountants, attorneys, or family members. Helpful. Convenient. Reasonable. The portal showed authorized users. And there, listed beneath my name, was Daniel. I stared at the screen. Not because I thought something illegal had happened. Because I didn't remember authorizing it. I sat back in my chair. Thinking. Maybe I had. Maybe there was a form during tax season. Maybe Daniel helped me set something up. Maybe I'd forgotten. All possible. The problem was that I couldn't remember. And uncertainty can be unsettling. Especially when you're already questioning other things. I decided not to jump to conclusions. Instead, I called Daniel. He answered immediately. "Hey, Mom." His voice sounded cheerful. Normal. I asked him directly. "Did I give you access to my property account?" A brief pause. Not long. But noticeable. Yes. The answer came quickly afterward. Too quickly. Like someone relieved there was an explanation available. When? Another pause. This one slightly longer. Last summer, I think. I waited. Daniel continued. "You asked me to help you review some tax information." That part sounded familiar. Sort of. Maybe. The problem wasn't that I thought he was lying. The problem was that I genuinely couldn't remember. And when memory becomes uncertain, trust becomes even more important. I see. My voice remained calm. Daniel sounded defensive now. Not aggressive. Defensive. There's a difference. I wasn't hiding anything, Mom. Interesting. I hadn't accused him of hiding anything. Yet that was the first thing he wanted to address. The conversation stayed with me long after we hung up. Not because of what Daniel said. Because of how he said it. Something felt off. Not dishonest. Just incomplete. Like a book with several missing chapters. A few days later, Rebecca stopped by. The weather was miserable. Freezing rain. Gray skies. The kind of Ohio afternoon that makes everyone want to stay home. She brought soup. Homemade chicken noodle. Exactly the kind Richard loved. We sat at the kitchen table. Talking about ordinary things. Work. Family. The grandchildren. Eventually I told her about the property portal. Rebecca's expression changed immediately. Not dramatically. Just enough. A slight tightening around the eyes. A brief silence. The sort of reaction people have when information confirms something they've already suspected. That got my attention. What? Rebecca looked down at her coffee. Then back at me. Mom. A pause. I think Daniel's under a lot more financial pressure than he's letting people know. The room felt suddenly smaller. Not because of the statement itself. Because it introduced a completely new possibility. For months, I'd been trying to understand motivation. Fear. Control. Concern. Family dynamics. Now another factor entered the picture. Money. I remained quiet. Letting her continue. Rebecca sighed. I don't know everything. Then tell me what you do know. She nodded slowly. I know his business has had a rough year. That surprised me. Daniel always projected success. Not fake success. Real success. At least I thought so. His consulting firm had grown steadily for years. Nice office. Nice home. Private school tuition. Vacations. Everything appeared stable. Rebecca shook her head. Appearances can be expensive. The sentence lingered. Because it felt true. Not just about Daniel. About many people. Especially these days. She continued. A few clients left. Some contracts didn't renew. He had to let people go. I listened carefully. Not judging. Not excusing. Simply listening. Because context matters. Pressure matters. Fear matters. They don't justify bad decisions. But they often explain them. And explanations are important if you're trying to understand someone you love. When Rebecca left that evening, I found myself looking at the situation through a different lens. Maybe Daniel wasn't planning some elaborate scheme. Maybe he was scared. Scared about me. Scared about money. Scared about the future. Human beings rarely operate from a single motivation. We are collections of fears, hopes, regrets, and good intentions. Mixed together. Sometimes beautifully. Sometimes disastrously. The following week brought another surprise. A church fundraiser. One of the annual events I helped organize. Nothing unusual. Our church community had been part of my life for decades. I knew almost everyone there. Or so I thought. Toward the end of the evening, I found myself speaking with a woman named Patricia. New to the congregation. Recently retired. Pleasant. Easy to talk to. Eventually the conversation turned to family. As it often does among people our age. Patricia smiled. Your son sounds devoted. I nodded. He is. And despite everything, I meant it. Patricia continued. My daughter keeps trying to manage my life too. I laughed. Perhaps a little too hard. Then she said something I would think about for weeks. Sometimes our children mistake access for authority. I nearly dropped my coffee. Not because she intended to be profound. Because she wasn't. She was simply describing her own life. Yet the sentence hit me with surprising force. Access. Not authority. Daniel had access to information. Access to records. Access to conversations. Access to concerns. But somewhere along the way, had he started believing that access gave him decision-making authority? More importantly, had I accidentally encouraged that belief? The question bothered me. Not because I knew the answer. Because I didn't. That night, I sat alone in Richard's old recliner. The same chair. The same living room. The same quiet house. I thought about Daniel. About Melissa. About Rebecca. About aging. About family. About control. And for the first time, I realized this conflict might not be about a house at all. The house was simply the battlefield. The real issue was something much deeper. Who gets to decide when an older person's independence should end? And what happens when family members disagree about the answer? I didn't know it yet. But within a few weeks, that question would stop being theoretical. Because I was about to discover evidence that Daniel and Melissa had already taken a step neither of them had told me about. A step they probably believed was responsible. Practical. Protective. The problem was, they never stopped to ask whether I wanted their protection in the first place. March arrived slowly. The snow began melting. The trees remained bare. And Ohio settled into that awkward season between winter and spring. Not quite cold. Not quite warm. A lot like my relationship with Daniel. Not broken. Not comfortable. Just suspended. Waiting for something. Neither of us knew exactly what. Or maybe we did. And neither of us wanted to admit it. For several weeks, life remained surprisingly quiet. No more brochures. No more discussions about moving. No more family meetings disguised as casual dinners. Part of me wondered if the situation was finally settling down. Another part knew better. People rarely abandon plans they spend a year creating. They simply adjust them. One Thursday morning, I attended my annual medical checkup. Nothing serious. Just the ordinary maintenance that comes with reaching your 70s. Blood pressure. Lab work. Questions about sleep. Questions about medications. Questions about whether you're still eating vegetables. Doctors seem oddly invested in vegetables. The appointment went well. Very well, actually. My doctor, Dr. Susan Harper, had treated me for nearly 15 years. She knew my history. She knew Richard. She knew my children. Small-town medicine often works that way. When she finished reviewing my results, she smiled. Eleanor, if all my patients were doing this well at 73, I'd retire happy. I laughed. That's the nicest thing you've said to me all year. I mean it. She tapped the chart. You're active. Your heart looks good. Your mobility is excellent. No major concerns. I felt relieved. Not because I expected bad news. Because good news becomes more valuable as you get older. You stop taking it for granted. Then Dr. Harper said something unexpected. Oh, and Daniel called last month. For a moment, I thought I misheard her. My son? She nodded. Yes. Immediately, something inside me tightened. Not fear. Not yet. Curiosity. What about? Dr. Harper looked mildly surprised. As though she assumed I already knew. That reaction was becoming disturbingly familiar. Oh. A pause. He had some questions. Questions. The word echoed inside my head. Questions about what? My health? My medications? My condition? My future? I kept my voice calm. What kind of questions? Dr. Harper hesitated. Not because she was hiding anything. Because she was realizing we might not be discussing the same conversation. He asked generally about aging. Another pause. Falls. Independent living. Cognitive decline. The room suddenly felt quieter. Not because of what she said. Because of what she didn't. Nobody asks those questions casually. Not in that combination. Not all at once. Dr. Harper quickly continued. I didn't share any private information. I hope you know that. I nodded immediately. Of course she didn't. She was a good doctor. A good person. That wasn't the issue. The issue was that Daniel had apparently been conducting research. Again. Without mentioning it. Dr. Harper seemed to sense my discomfort. Eleanor, adult children ask these kinds of questions all the time. That probably was true. Maybe even normal. But normal things can still hurt. Especially when they happen behind your back. I thanked her. Finished the appointment. Walked to my car. And sat there for several minutes before starting the engine. Thinking. Always thinking. At 73, you spend a surprising amount of time thinking. About the past. About the future. About conversations that didn't seem important until later. This was becoming one of those conversations. That evening, I called Rebecca. Not because I needed advice. Because I needed perspective. The older I get, the more I value perspective. Facts tell you what happened. Perspective helps explain why. Rebecca listened quietly. Then sighed. A familiar sigh. The kind that suggested she wasn't surprised. You knew? I asked. Not exactly. Not exactly. Another answer that wasn't really an answer. Rebecca continued. I know Melissa has been worried about your health for years. Years. There was that word again. Years. Apparently everyone had been worrying for years. Everyone except me. Or maybe I simply interpreted things differently. That possibility bothered me. Perhaps more than the alternative. Because if everyone saw a problem except me. What did that mean? The question followed me for days. Then something happened that complicated everything. A Saturday afternoon. Nothing remarkable. I was carrying a basket of laundry down the basement stairs. A task I'd completed thousands of times. Maybe tens of thousands. One hand on the railing. One step at a time. Normal. Routine. Familiar. Then my foot slipped. Just slightly. One small movement. One moment of imbalance. Nothing dramatic. I didn't fall. I caught myself immediately. No injury. No bruises. No broken bones. The entire incident lasted perhaps 2 seconds. Yet afterward, I found myself sitting on the basement steps. Heart racing. Not because I was hurt. Because I suddenly understood Daniel's fear. For the first time. Not intellectually. Emotionally. The difference matters. You can understand something with your mind for years. Then one moment arrives and suddenly you feel it. And feeling changes everything. I sat there for several minutes. Thinking about Richard. Thinking about aging. Thinking about vulnerability. The truth is, independence and invincibility are not the same thing. I knew that. Always had. The problem was that Daniel seemed unable to separate them. In his mind, any risk justified intervention. In my mind, some risks were simply part of living. Neither perspective was entirely wrong. That realization made the conflict harder, not easier. The following week brought another surprise. Melissa called. Not Daniel. Melissa. That almost never happened. Most communication flowed through my son. Always had. So when her name appeared on my phone, I answered immediately. Eleanor? Her voice sounded nervous, which was unusual. Melissa was many things. Nervous was rarely one of them. Everything okay? A long pause. Then. I think we need to talk. There it was. The sentence every family dreads. Not because it's dramatic. Because it usually isn't. The most important conversations rarely are. We agreed to meet for lunch the following Tuesday. Just the two of us. No Daniel. No Rebecca. No grandchildren. No audience. When the day arrived, we met at a small cafe near downtown. The place was quiet. Comfortable. Mostly retirees and office workers. Melissa arrived 5 minutes early. Another unusual detail. She looked tired. Far more tired than I'd ever seen her. The confident woman who normally managed everything seemed worn down. For several moments we discussed ordinary things. Weather. School schedules. Work. The usual. Eventually Melissa set down her coffee cup. Then looked directly at me. No rehearsed smile. No polite conversation. Just honesty. And what she said next changed the way I saw her. Not completely. But significantly. Eleanor. Her voice cracked slightly. I don't think Daniel is handling this very well. For several seconds, I simply stared at her. Because after months of tension. Months of assumptions. Months of feeling like Melissa and Daniel were operating as a team. This was the last thing I expected to hear. Not criticism. Concern. Concern about her own husband. And suddenly I realized something important. Maybe this wasn't Daniel and Melissa versus me. Maybe everyone involved was struggling in ways nobody else fully understood. Including me. The conversation that followed would reveal something about Daniel that nobody had told me before. Something that explained many of his actions. Not excused them. Explained them. And for the first time, I would begin to understand what he was truly afraid of. It wasn't my house. It wasn't money. It wasn't even aging. It was something much more personal. And much more painful. Melissa sat quietly for a moment after speaking. The noise of the cafe continued around us. Coffee cups clinked. People chatted. A waitress refilled drinks at a nearby table. Ordinary sounds. Ordinary life. Yet somehow it felt as though the entire room had become still. Because for months, I had been trying to understand what was happening. And now Melissa was finally opening a door that had remained closed. I don't think Daniel is handling this very well. I repeated her words softly. Melissa shook her head. No. For a moment, she looked less like my daughter-in-law and more like a tired wife. A woman worried about someone she loved. A woman carrying concerns she didn't know how to solve. I waited. Eventually she continued. Do you remember what happened when Richard died? The question surprised me. Not because I had forgotten. Because some losses never leave you. You simply learn how to carry them. Of course I remember. Melissa nodded. Then looked down at her coffee. Daniel never really talks about that year. I remained silent. Listening. He was terrified. The statement caught me off guard. Terrified? That wasn't the word I would have chosen. Heartbroken. Yes. Grieving. Certainly. Lost. Absolutely. But terrified? Melissa seemed to read my expression. He thought he was going to lose you too. For several seconds, I didn't know what to say. Because suddenly I was seeing that period through someone else's eyes. When Richard died, I was focused on survival. Paying bills. Making arrangements. Learning how to live alone. Getting through one day at a time. I hadn't spent much time wondering what Daniel experienced. Not because I didn't care. Because grief narrows your vision. Sometimes all you can see is the next step. Melissa continued. He called me constantly. A small smile crossed her face. 5 times a day sometimes. I almost laughed. That sounded like Daniel. He kept asking whether you sounded okay. Whether I thought you were eating. Whether I thought you were sleeping. A pause. He was convinced something terrible would happen. The words lingered between us. Because suddenly pieces began fitting together. Not all of them. But some. Melissa sighed. For a while it got better. Then the years started passing. Then you got older. She stopped. Searching for the right words. Finally she found them. I don't think Daniel ever stopped being scared. The statement hit me harder than I expected. Not because it excused everything. It didn't. Fear explains behavior. It doesn't automatically justify it. Still. Understanding matters. Especially within families. I sat quietly. Thinking about my son. Not the 50-year-old consultant. Not the father of 2. Not the homeowner. Not the businessman. The little boy. The little boy who used to crawl into our bed during thunderstorms. The little boy who cried when Richard traveled for work. The little boy who worried more than most children. Perhaps some parts of us never truly disappear. Perhaps they simply grow older alongside the rest of us. Melissa looked relieved that I wasn't angry. Then she said something even more revealing. Last year changed him. That immediately caught my attention. Last year? She nodded. The business problems. Of course. Rebecca had mentioned them. The lost clients. The financial pressure. The uncertainty. Melissa stared out the window. He won't admit it. But he's been struggling. A pause. He feels responsible for everything. The company. The employees. The mortgage. The kids. Me. Everyone. And suddenly the situation became even more complicated. Because now multiple fears were colliding. Fear of losing his mother. Fear of financial instability. Fear of failing his family. Fear of losing control. People under that kind of pressure don't always make good decisions. Sometimes they convince themselves they're helping when they're actually overstepping. I thought about Daniel contacting the real estate agent. The doctor. The property portal. The retirement communities. Perhaps all those actions came from the same place. A desire to solve a problem before it became a crisis. The issue was that nobody had agreed there was a crisis. Especially me. When lunch ended, Melissa surprised me again. She reached across the table. Touched my hand gently. And said, I need you to know something. I looked up. No matter what happens. She swallowed. You are not a burden. The sentence struck me directly in the heart. Because although nobody had used that word, I had begun wondering. Quietly. Privately. The way many older people do. You start noticing worried looks. Conversations about safety. Discussions about the future. And eventually a question forms. Am I becoming a problem everyone else has to manage? Melissa squeezed my hand. I mean that. I believed her. Completely. For the first time in many months. I believed her. When we left the cafe, the sky had begun clearing. Spring was finally arriving. Slowly. Reluctantly. But arriving. A few days later, something happened that changed everything. Not dramatically. Not overnight. But permanently. It started with a letter. An ordinary envelope. Nothing special. The kind of mail most people throw into a pile without thinking. The return address belonged to a local law office. At first, I assumed it was junk mail. Advertisements. Estate planning services. Retirement seminars. The sort of thing people my age receive constantly. I almost threw it away. Almost. Instead, I opened it. Inside was a brief notice. Professional. Polite. Routine. The law office was contacting property owners in the area regarding a proposed development project. Several nearby parcels might eventually be purchased. Market values were expected to increase significantly. The information itself wasn't shocking. What caught my attention was the map enclosed with the letter. A development company had identified several blocks near my neighborhood, including land less than a mile away. I stared at the map. Then at the estimated future values. Then back at the map again. Something suddenly clicked. For months, I had assumed Daniel's interest in the house centered on concern. Then later, I wondered whether money was part of the equation. Now another possibility emerged. Not greed. Opportunity. Those aren't always the same thing. A person doesn't need to be evil to see opportunity. They simply need to believe they're being practical. The thought bothered me enough that I called Carol. My friend listened carefully. Then asked one simple question. Have you ever actually told Daniel what you want? I opened my mouth. Then closed it. Because despite months of tension, months of assumptions, months of worry, the answer was surprisingly unclear. No. Not really. I defended my independence. Questioned his plans. Reacted to events. But I had never clearly defined my own vision. Carol laughed softly. Well, there's your first problem. Maybe she was right. Maybe everyone had become so focused on what might happen that nobody discussed what should happen. Including me. That realization stayed with me for several days. And then Easter arrived. The entire family gathered after church. The grandchildren hunted eggs. Rebecca brought dessert. Melissa hosted brunch. Everything appeared pleasant. Normal. Comfortable. Until halfway through the afternoon. That's when Emma accidentally revealed something that nobody intended me to hear. Something that would finally force the entire family into an honest conversation. The kind we should have had months earlier. And once those words were spoken, there would be no going back. Easter Sunday had always been one of my favorite holidays. Not because of the food. Not because of the traditions. Because it brought everyone together. At least for a few hours. The grandchildren were outside searching for eggs in the backyard. Melissa was arranging desserts on the dining table. Rebecca was helping clean up after brunch. Daniel stood near the patio talking with a neighbor who had stopped by to say hello. Everything felt ordinary. Comfortable. Familiar. The kind of afternoon that reminds you why family matters. Which is probably why what happened next hurt as much as it did. Not because anyone intended to hurt me. But because truth has a way of appearing when people stop paying attention. I was standing near the kitchen island when Emma walked in carrying her phone. She looked frustrated. The way teenagers do when technology refuses to cooperate. Mom, can you send me that floor plan again? Melissa looked up. What floor plan? The one for Grandma's house. The room went silent. Not dramatically. Just enough. Enough for everyone to notice. Enough for everyone to stop moving. Emma froze almost immediately. Realizing she had said something she wasn't supposed to say. Melissa's face changed first. Then Daniel's. Then Rebecca's. I looked from one person to another. Nobody spoke. Which told me everything I needed to know. When several adults react with panic to a simple sentence, there is usually a reason. Finally I asked. What floor plan? Emma looked miserable. Poor girl. She hadn't done anything wrong. She simply didn't know she was carrying information nobody wanted shared. Daniel stepped forward. Mom. But I raised my hand gently. Not angry. Not yet. Let her answer. Emma looked toward her parents. Then toward me. Caught in the middle. Exactly where children often find themselves during family conflicts. It was for a school project. The explanation arrived quickly. Too quickly. I had raised children. I knew the difference between a prepared answer and a genuine one. This was not genuine. I waited. Silence can be remarkably effective. Eventually Emma sighed. The way teenagers do when they realize the adults are making everything more complicated. Dad asked me to help. Another silence. Longer this time. I turned toward Daniel. He looked exhausted. Not guilty. Exhausted. As though the effort of managing all these half-truths had finally become too much. What kind of floor plan? For several seconds, nobody answered. Then Melissa surprised me. Again. She spoke first. The renovation concept. There it was. Finally. Not the entire truth. But more truth than I'd received in months. I felt something settle inside me. Not anger. Clarity. Because suddenly the scattered pieces started fitting together. The real estate questions. The discussions. The location. The future plans. The assumptions. All of it. Not because Daniel was secretly trying to throw me out. Because somewhere along the way, he had begun imagining life after I left. The problem was that he forgot to tell me. I looked directly at my son. When exactly were you planning renovations for my house? Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Then Daniel did something unexpected. For the first time since this entire situation began. He stopped defending himself. Instead, he told the truth. The real truth. Not the polished version. Not the reassuring version. The truth. We've talked about it. His voice was quiet. Almost defeated. We've talked about it for a long time. There it was. The confirmation. Not a crime. Not a conspiracy. Something more human. And in many ways. More painful. Because it wasn't malicious. It was presumptuous. Daniel continued. Mom, we weren't planning to force you out. I know. And we weren't trying to take anything. I know. His eyes widened slightly. Perhaps he expected anger. Accusations. A fight. Instead I simply looked tired. Because that's how I felt. Tired. Very tired. The room remained silent. Then Rebecca spoke. The first person brave enough to say what everyone else seemed afraid to acknowledge. Maybe the problem isn't what you wanted. She looked directly at Daniel. Maybe the problem is that you acted like it was already decided. The sentence landed with surprising force. Because it was true. Not entirely. But enough. Daniel looked down. Melissa looked away. And suddenly nobody had an argument. Because there wasn't one. The issue had never been concern. Concern was real. The issue had never been fear. Fear was real too. The issue was certainty. Everyone became so certain they knew what was best for me. That nobody remembered to ask me. The conversation that followed lasted nearly 2 hours. Longer than any family discussion we'd had in years. And for the first time, people stopped talking around each other. They started talking honestly. Daniel admitted he had been terrified ever since Richard died. Not every day. Not constantly. But often. The older I became, the worse it got. Every unanswered phone call. Every winter storm. Every mention of a doctor's appointment. Each one fed a fear he rarely discussed. Melissa admitted something too. The development project near my neighborhood had absolutely influenced her thinking. Not because she wanted to steal anything. Because she genuinely believed keeping the property within the family was smart. Practical. Responsible. Rebecca admitted she'd been frustrated for months. Watching everyone talk about me instead of talking to me. And then it was my turn. I sat quietly for a moment. Gathering my thoughts. 73 years of life teaches you many things. One of them is that timing matters. Sometimes people can only hear the truth after they've exhausted every other argument. I understand why you're worried. I looked at Daniel. And I meant it. I really do. His eyes immediately softened. But understanding isn't the same thing as agreeing. A pause. Being older doesn't mean I stop being myself. Nobody interrupted. Nobody argued. So I continued. I may decide to move one day. The room remained still. I may decide not to. Another pause. But that decision belongs to me. Simple words. Nothing dramatic. Yet somehow they felt important. Necessary. Long overdue. Daniel nodded slowly. For the first time in months. He wasn't trying to convince me of anything. He was listening. Actually listening. Then he asked a question. Perhaps the first question he should have asked from the beginning. What do you want, Mom? The room became very quiet. Because everyone realized something. After nearly a year of planning. Nearly a year of discussions. Nearly a year of assumptions. Nobody knew the answer. Including me. I smiled sadly. Because honesty requires courage. Especially with family. I don't know yet. The answer surprised some people. Not me. It was the truth. The real truth. I wasn't ready to leave. But I wasn't promising I'd stay forever either. Life changes. Health changes. Circumstances change. Wisdom means leaving room for reality. The conversation ended differently than I expected. No dramatic victory. No family collapse. No villain exposed. Just tired people finally telling the truth. And somehow, that felt more meaningful. When I drove home that evening, I felt lighter than I had in months. Not because every problem was solved. Because it wasn't. But because honesty had finally entered the room. And honesty changes things. Sometimes slowly. Sometimes painfully. But always meaningfully. As I pulled into my driveway, I noticed the old maple tree Richard planted decades ago. Its branches were beginning to bloom. Spring had finally arrived. And for the first time in a long while, I felt hopeful. What I didn't realize then was that the most important decision of this entire story still lay ahead. Not Daniel's decision. Not Melissa's. Mine. And before the summer ended, I would face a choice that forced me to answer the question everyone had been asking. What did Eleanor Whitaker truly want for the rest of her life? After Easter, life became quieter. Not because everything had been solved. Because everyone was thinking. Really thinking. For the first time in a long while, nobody seemed interested in convincing anyone else. Daniel stopped sending suggestions. Melissa stopped forwarding articles about retirement living. Rebecca stopped playing referee. And I stopped preparing arguments. The silence felt different now. Healthier. Like a wound that had finally been cleaned. Still tender. But healing. Spring settled fully over Ohio. The maple tree Richard planted years ago filled with leaves again. The flower beds along the front porch started blooming. Neighbors returned outdoors. Children rode bicycles. The world felt alive. And for the first time in nearly a year, I found myself looking forward instead of backward. One Saturday morning, I was working in the garden when my phone rang. It was Carol. My friend rarely called before 10 o'clock. Which meant she either had exciting news or gossip. With Carol, it was usually one of those two. Put on something nice. I laughed. Why? Because you're going somewhere with me. I should have known better than to ask questions. An hour later, we were driving across town. Carol remained annoyingly mysterious the entire trip. When we finally arrived, I immediately understood. It wasn't a retirement community. It wasn't an apartment complex. It wasn't a real estate office. It was a community center. A newly renovated building attached to a public library. Inside were classrooms, workshops, volunteer programs, social activities, art studios, book clubs, community gardens. Dozens of opportunities. People of all ages moved through the building. Young parents, retirees, college students, veterans, teachers. Everyone. The place felt alive. Carol watched me carefully. I thought you might like it. And surprisingly, I did. Very much. Over the next few weeks, I returned several times. Not because I was lonely. Because I was curious. There is a difference. Curiosity keeps people young. At least that's what I believe. One afternoon I attended a writing workshop. Another day I volunteered with a literacy program. The following week I joined a community garden project. Nothing dramatic. Nothing life-changing. Yet somehow, everything felt meaningful. For years after Richard died, I had focused on preserving my life. Maintaining routines. Protecting traditions. Holding on to familiar things. There is comfort in that. But there is also danger. Because eventually preservation can become stagnation. Without realizing it, I had spent years protecting a chapter that had already ended. Not because I wanted to live in the past. Because I wasn't sure what came next. Now, for the first time, I was beginning to find out. One evening, Daniel stopped by unexpectedly. Alone. No Melissa. No grandchildren. Just Daniel. We sat on the back porch watching the sunset. The same porch Richard built nearly 30 years ago. The same porch where countless family conversations had happened. For a while, neither of us said much. Then Daniel broke the silence. You seem happier. I smiled. I think I am. He nodded slowly. As though he was trying to understand something. Then he surprised me. Again. I owe you an apology. The words hung in the air. Simple. Direct. Unexpected. I didn't rush to answer. At my age, apologies matter. Not because they erase mistakes. Because they reveal growth. Daniel looked toward the backyard. I spent so much time worrying about losing you. A pause. That I stopped listening to you. The honesty in his voice caught me off guard. Because it wasn't rehearsed. It wasn't defensive. It wasn't designed to win an argument. It was genuine. And genuine things are rare. Especially in family conflicts. I know you were scared. I said it softly. Not to excuse him. To acknowledge him. Daniel laughed quietly. A sad laugh. The funny thing is. He shook his head. I kept telling myself I was helping. There it was. The heart of the entire story. Not greed. Not cruelty. Not manipulation. Fear disguised as help. A surprisingly common problem. Especially among people who love each other. The conversation lasted nearly 2 hours. Longer than any conversation we'd had in years. We talked about Richard. The business. The grandchildren. The future. And somewhere during that conversation, I realized something important. Daniel wasn't trying to control my life anymore. He was trying to understand it. That distinction changed everything. A few weeks later, another surprise arrived. This one came from Rebecca. My daughter invited me to lunch. Just the two of us. Something she hadn't done in quite a while. Halfway through the meal, she smiled. You know what the funniest part of all this is? I shook my head. What? Rebecca laughed. For months, everyone kept asking where you should live. I nodded. That was true. And nobody noticed you were busy building a life exactly where you already were. The sentence stayed with me. Because she was right. The entire family had become obsessed with location. The house. The property. The neighborhood. The future. Meanwhile, the real issue had never been the building. It was the life inside it. A house by itself is just wood and drywall. What matters is whether you're still living. Really living. Not simply existing. That summer brought another change. A small one. But meaningful. I hired a contractor. Not to sell the house. Not to prepare it for someone else. For me. We added safer railings. Improved lighting. Updated a few things. Nothing extravagant. Just practical improvements. The kind that made life easier. And as I watched the work being completed, I realized something. For nearly a year, everyone had been acting as though there were only two choices. Stay forever. Or leave immediately. But life rarely works that way. There are often options sitting quietly in the middle. You simply have to stop arguing long enough to see them. By late summer, family gatherings felt different. Lighter. More honest. The tension hadn't disappeared completely. Families don't work that way. But something important had changed. People were talking with each other instead of about each other. And that alone solved more problems than anyone expected. One evening, while watching Emma and Caleb play in the backyard, I found myself thinking about the future again. Not with fear. Not with anxiety. With curiosity. Because for the first time, the future belonged to me again. Not Daniel. Not Melissa. Not Rebecca. Me. And once that truth became clear, another realization followed. The biggest decision I needed to make wasn't about where I would live. It was about how I wanted to live. And before the year ended, an opportunity would arrive that forced me to answer that question once and for all. The opportunity arrived in September. Quietly. The way most important opportunities do. Not with fanfare. Not with headlines. Not with dramatic announcements. Just a simple conversation on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. I was helping at the literacy program when the director approached me. Her name was Janet. A wonderful woman in her early 60s. Practical. Organized. The sort of person who somehow remembers everyone's birthday. Janet waited until the last volunteer had left. Then she smiled. Eleanor, can I ask you something? I laughed. That depends. She laughed too. Then grew serious. I'm retiring next year. That surprised me. Not because Janet was old. Because she seemed impossible to replace. Every organization has one person like that. The person who quietly holds everything together. When they leave, everyone suddenly realizes how much they were doing. Janet continued. The board wants to expand the program. A pause. And they've asked if I'd help identify someone to guide it. I nodded. Still unsure where the conversation was heading. Then she looked directly at me. We were hoping you'd consider it. For several seconds, I honestly thought she was joking. Me? At 73? Leading anything? I almost laughed. Then I realized she wasn't joking at all. The strange thing about aging is that sometimes your self-image gets stuck. Inside your head, you still feel 45. Maybe 50. Then you catch your reflection in a store window and remember otherwise. I stared at Janet. Surely there are younger people. There are. She smiled. But that's not what I asked. The answer stayed with me for days. Maybe weeks. Because the offer wasn't really about the position. It was about possibility. For years, people had been talking about what I might lose. My independence. My mobility. My future options. My house. My safety. Everything focused on limitation. This was different. This conversation focused on contribution. On purpose. On growth. And suddenly I realized how much I had missed hearing those kinds of conversations. The following Sunday, the entire family gathered for dinner. Nothing unusual. Just one of those regular family evenings that had slowly become comfortable again. The tension from earlier in the year felt distant now. Not forgotten. But understood. Like a scar. Still visible. No longer painful. After dessert, I decided to tell everyone about Janet's offer. The reaction was immediate. Emma practically bounced out of her chair. "Grandma, that's amazing." Caleb agreed. Rebecca smiled. Melissa looked genuinely excited. Even Daniel seemed impressed. For a moment, I simply enjoyed the feeling. Not because everyone approved. Because nobody looked at me like someone whose life was winding down. They looked at me like someone whose life was still moving forward. The difference mattered more than I can explain. Then Daniel said something that nearly made me cry. Not because it was dramatic. Because it was sincere. "You'd be great at it." Such a simple sentence. Yet months earlier, Daniel had been focused entirely on protecting me. Now he was encouraging me. Supporting me. Believing in me. That felt important. Growth isn't always loud. Sometimes it sounds like one sentence spoken at exactly the right moment. A few weeks later, I accepted the position. Not because I needed something to do. I already had plenty to do. I accepted because it excited me. That was reason enough. At 73, I've learned that excitement becomes valuable. You shouldn't ignore it when it appears. The role wasn't full-time. Nothing close. But it gave me purpose. Goals. Projects. People to help. And every week I found myself looking forward to it more. One afternoon, while organizing volunteer schedules, I came across an old photograph. A group picture from a community event years earlier. Richard was standing beside me. Smiling. Younger. Healthier. Alive. I sat quietly for a long moment. Studying his face. Thinking about everything that had happened. The grief. The family conflict. The misunderstandings. The fear. The healing. Then something unexpected happened. I laughed. Not because anything was funny. Because I suddenly knew exactly what Richard would say. He would shake his head. Smile that crooked smile. And say, "Took you long enough." Because Richard always believed life should keep moving. Not recklessly. Not carelessly. But forward. Always forward. For years after his death, I thought honoring him meant preserving what we built. Holding on to it. Protecting it. Never letting it change. Now I understood something different. Maybe honoring him meant continuing to live. Fully. Courageously. Without permission. That realization changed everything. Near the end of October, Daniel asked if we could have lunch together. Just the two of us. We met at a diner we'd both loved for years. The same place where I used to take him after Little League games. The same place where he once spilled an entire milkshake into my purse when he was 8. Some memories never disappear. Halfway through lunch, he became unusually quiet. Then he reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out an envelope, and slid it across the table. I looked at him. "What is this?" Daniel smiled nervously. "Open it." Inside was a single sheet of paper. At first, I didn't understand what I was looking at. Then I did. Slowly. Very slowly. Because the gesture mattered more than the document itself. Far more. I looked back up at him. Unable to speak for a moment. Daniel swallowed. Then said, "I should have done this a long time ago." The envelope contained updated legal paperwork. Property access permissions. Emergency contacts. Various authorizations. All revised. All simplified. All under my control. Not his. Mine. If assistance was ever needed, I would decide. If changes were ever necessary, I would decide. The document didn't change my life. The symbolism did. For the first time since this entire conflict began, Daniel was no longer trying to manage my future. He was respecting it. And that changed our relationship more than any argument ever could. As we left the diner that afternoon, the autumn leaves drifted across the parking lot. Orange. Gold. Red. Beautiful. Temporary. A reminder that every season eventually changes. Families do too. The question is whether they change together. Or apart. Fortunately for us, I was beginning to believe we had chosen the first path. What neither of us realized then was that one final conversation still remained. A conversation that would finally answer the question at the center of this entire story. Not where I would live. Not who was right. Not who was wrong. But what family truly means when everyone involved is trying their best. And still making mistakes. Winter returned almost exactly 1 year after my 73rd birthday. Not with the same uncertainty. Not with the same tension. Not with the same fear. This winter felt different. Calmer. Softer. Earned. Because a great deal can change in a year. Especially when people finally start listening to one another. The literacy program continued to grow. More volunteers joined. More students enrolled. More lives changed. Every Tuesday and Thursday morning, I found myself walking through the doors of the community center with a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in years. Not because I was trying to stay busy. Because I was helping. And helping has a remarkable way of reminding us that we still matter. One afternoon, while organizing materials for a reading workshop, I looked around the room and noticed something. Most of the volunteers were retired. Former teachers. Former nurses. Former accountants. Former business owners. People who had spent decades building careers. Families. Communities. Now they were building something else. Connection. And it struck me how wrong we often are about aging. People talk about getting older as though life slowly becomes smaller. Sometimes it does. But sometimes it becomes deeper. You stop chasing everything. And start appreciating what truly matters. That lesson took me 74 years to fully understand. By Christmas, family gatherings felt completely different than they had a year earlier. Not perfect. No family is perfect. But honest. And honesty is far more valuable. Daniel and I still disagreed occasionally. Melissa still worried more than I thought she should. Rebecca still played peacemaker whenever tensions appeared. Some things never change. But the difference was respect. Everyone finally understood where the boundaries belonged. And once those boundaries were respected, peace returned. On Christmas Eve, the entire family gathered at my house. My house. I smiled every time I thought those words. Not because I was trying to prove a point. Because I finally understood something. The house had never been the victory. The house was just a house. The real victory was keeping ownership of my own choices. That was what I had been fighting for all along. Not property. Agency. The right to remain the author of my own life. The grandchildren helped decorate cookies in the kitchen. Melissa laughed when Caleb somehow managed to spill frosting on his shirt, the counter, and the floor at the same time. Rebecca brought enough food to feed half the county. Daniel hung Christmas lights outside despite insisting every year that he hated doing it. Richard would have loved that evening. Not because everything was perfect. Because everyone was together. That mattered to him. It mattered to me too. Later that night, after the grandchildren had gone home and the dishes were finally washed, Daniel and I sat alone in the living room. The Christmas tree glowed softly in the corner. For a while, neither of us spoke. Then Daniel looked around the room. The family photographs. The old furniture. The memories. And quietly said, "You know, I think I understand now." I smiled. "Understand what?" He laughed softly. "Why you wanted to stay." I looked around the room too. The answer wasn't actually in the walls. Or the furniture. Or the photographs. It was something deeper. "This place reminds me who I am." Daniel nodded. And for the first time, I knew he truly understood. Not because he agreed with every decision I made. Because he finally respected that they were mine to make. That was enough. More than enough. A few months later, spring arrived once again. The maple tree Richard planted began blooming. Just as it had every year before. And just as it would someday continue blooming after all of us were gone. Life has a way of teaching humility like that. We matter. But we're also part of something larger. Families. Communities. Generations. The older I get, the more comforting I find that thought. One afternoon, while sitting on the back porch, I opened an old photo album. Inside were pictures from nearly every chapter of my life. My wedding day. The children's birthdays. Family vacations. Graduations. Anniversaries. Christmas mornings. Ordinary moments. Extraordinary moments. A lifetime. As I turned the pages, I realized something important. The most valuable thing Richard and I ever built wasn't this house. It wasn't our savings. It wasn't any possession. It was a family capable of learning. A family capable of making mistakes. And then finding its way back to one another. That doesn't happen automatically. It takes humility. Patience. Forgiveness. And sometimes a few very uncomfortable conversations. But it's worth it. Always worth it. Looking back now, I don't see villains in this story. I see people. People who loved each other. People who were afraid. People who made assumptions. People who got things wrong. Including me. Especially me, at times. Because wisdom isn't knowing everything. Wisdom is remaining willing to learn. Even at 74. Maybe especially at 74. If there is one lesson I hope remains after my story ends, it's this. Growing older does not mean surrendering your voice. And loving someone does not give you ownership of their choices. Both things can be true at the same time. We can care deeply for one another, while still respecting each other's independence. In fact, that's probably what healthy love looks like. And now, my dear friends. Before we say goodbye tonight, I want to ask you something. Have you ever experienced a time when someone you loved thought they knew what was best for you? Did you stand your ground? Or did you eventually discover a compromise together? I'd truly love to hear your story in the comments below. Because one of the most beautiful things about this little corner of the internet is realizing that none of us walk these roads alone. And if Eleanor's story touched your heart today, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our Family Story Corner. Your support helps us continue sharing stories about family, resilience, forgiveness, and the lessons life teaches us along the way. Most importantly, call someone you love. Listen a little longer. Judge a little less. And never underestimate the power of an honest conversation. Until next time, my dear friends. Stay safe. Stay kind. Protect your peace. Treasure your loved ones. And remember, you are never too old to choose the next chapter of your life. Good night. Sweet dreams. The end.